My first time speaking at the ComArts conference, I did a talk on cancel culture and how I feel it's a non-issue for the people who tend to complain about it, and how our focus should actually be centered on being accountable towards those who are the most marginalized in our communities, who are far more easily disposed of. This was using a framework of disposability politics, which is birthed out of critical disability studies. And since then, my interest in disability justice and critical prison studies has only grown further. Since the protests of the summer of 2020, critical examinations of the way in which the state engages with the general population, especially the marginalized, has become far more commonplace in everyday conversations. Here are a few facts about incarceration as it currently exists in the United States. According to the Population Reference Bureau, the United States of America actually has the highest incarceration rate in the world, the largest incarcerated population, and in 2019 was reported to contribute 25% of the world's overall prison population, which is roughly 2.19 million people. And this is despite the US only being 4% of the world's population. So the first question is, why is our incarceration rate so high? And especially considering this is only the prisons, this is only penal incarceration. There are multiple forms of incarceration beyond the penal incarceration, which pertains to prisons. There are asylums and mental institutions. There are containment camps at the border. There are indigenous residential schools. There are military and internment camps. And early forms of incarceration included what were known as almhouses or poorhouses, as well as schools for the intellectually disabled. And many of these systems have involved unethical practices and harm that has come to the people who are within these institutions. Laura Appelman has an article called Deviancy, Dependency, and Disability, in which is discussed how incarceration was actually a contemporary invention of the 17th century following Enlightenment ideals. Because prior to that, during the pre-Enlightenment period, in the medieval era, we often saw that punishment was brutal and vicious torture, to put it frankly. Often it involved death and very violent means such as burning or various ways of eviscerating the body. So in many ways, incarceration was in fact a progressive reform from the ways of old. And Appelman continues to detail how little distinction was made in populations between prisons, asylums, and poorhouses when incarceration first came about. And she goes on to make the argument that the reason that these systems came to be was out of a means of social control, where there was a very narrow definition that came about as a result of how we now defined human. And there was a very narrow definition of civility. And in order to be civilized, you had to fit a very narrow norm. And anybody who fell outside of that was in need of being curbed and controlled so that they would be able to contribute to society as a civilized individual. Now, when it comes to conversations of the prison, we need to see how it started and who it included and who it excluded. The title is Incarcerated Identities, Intersectional Identities. And my concerns here are racialized and disabled peoples. So I looked into what slavery was like for disabled slaves. And it was also a necessary thought experiment because Angela Davis, who is considered to be one of the founders of critical prison studies, outlines how prisons, after the emancipation of slavery, in addition to Jim Crow segregation laws, there were also several petty laws placed with the intention of criminalizing Black people for things as simple as vagrancy, which is just being outside and not doing anything, thus placing them back in captivity and exploiting them for their labor. And she deems this practice of prison becoming a camp for labor as the prison industrial complex. I also read this article called Useless, which spoke about how disabled slaves were interacted with during American chattel slavery. It looks into how these slaves were called useless when it's very clear that they were actually doing things. These slaves had tasks such as cooking for other slaves, nursing other slaves, raking trash, and caring for infants and the nursery and all of the slave children. Objectively productive tasks, but since they weren't immediately profitable to their owners, they were deemed useless. And what an interesting contradiction that you can be useless while actively being of use. It really led me to start questioning how this language is approached and how these identities are formed. There was also the practice of manumission for disabled slaves, where once a slave became useless enough that they were no longer worth keeping around, if they weren't simply left to die of exposure or malnourishment on the plantation, they were released into society with no resources. And at a time when Black people were not in the best financial situation, given most Black people were enslaved, and the public perception and treatment of Black people was terrible, these people often died either out of not having their basic needs met or at the hands of violence of those who hated them. And it was really interesting to see, well, first of all, the cruelty and the way that this was often used as an argument that slave owners were benevolent as they eventually released their slaves, knowing now that that's what the actual reality was for a lot of freed individuals. But I realized that it had a thread with some of the prison studies I was reading from the modern era, where it seemed that we have incarcerated persons who want to reintegrate into society after getting out of prison, and how they often face struggles with not having the resources to reintegrate correctly. They had trouble adapting to society, as society within the prison was structured very different from society without the prison. There were lots of codependency issues, there was a lot of difficulty socially interacting with other people, as well as the stigma that surrounded how they were treated, made things very difficult. So you couldn't find employment if you have a criminal record. It makes it very difficult for you to maintain a job, and if you can't hold an income, once again, these basic needs aren't being met, as well as just the general human need for to be social and to interact with other people. So it was very interesting how a system that was propagated by slavery and propagated by anti-Black racism sort of had these similar practices just simply in a new form. And it really lends to what Michelle Alexander nicknames the new Jim Crow, in which it talks about mass incarceration as it exists today, and how the sad and chilling reality for these people is that they were found more useful while incarcerated because their labor was available at minimal cost and with little regard towards their humanity. And I think it shows how productivity is sometimes valued over the human, and productivity can be valued even more over the human if the human is not seen as human. This leads to a question. What do I mean by that? Well, we see that it all comes back to eugenics. Eugenics was a movement which assigns values to others inherent to their physical and mental capabilities, their sex, their gender, their race, as well as other factors that we deem to be integral to who a human being is. It was often used for the incarceration of many people. The reason so many disabled, whether that be physically or intellectually or mentally, were separated from the rest of society in almshouses and hospitals and asylums was because they were believed that they would bring down society as a whole, that their disabilities would be infectious, that reproducing with them would lead to a weaker human population. The same logic was applied to racialized people. Eugenics was so commonplace that even certain anti-colonialist thinkers, such as Bartolomé de las Casas, used it to argue that indigenous Americans should not be enslaved, and that the treatment that was posited against them was harmful and inhumane, which is why Black people should be enslaved, and they should be the ones who were subjected to it, as they were not an intelligent civilization, as opposed to the indigenous Americans. And Bartolomé, que sopa, that's not cool, but it's just really awkward. But if we get into some rapid philosophy really quickly, ontology is a metaphysical field of philosophy that specializes in questions of existence and being. It discusses how entities are grouped into basic categories and how they exist on the most fundamental level. Ontologically, some questions we want to ask are slaves human? What does it mean to be Black? If Black people are ontologically reduced to slaves and laborers, are those Black people being seen as human? If indigenous Americans are being onto-reductively viewed as savages, do they possess humanity? Now, I've thrown a lot of facts, I've even thrown some philosophy, I've thrown a lot of history and grim realities. You're probably wondering, what is the purpose of it all? I think this speech is likely not going to turn you into America's next top abolitionist or into the next disability activist, but I do want you to consider how we view and define the people around us. The people who have been subjected to these realities of incarceration are often stripped of their humanity. And I think it's important that we understand how we're viewing those around us, how we're validating their existence as creations of God. Everyone has inherent value. Eugenics so easily finds its way into our modern thinking, and it is so important that we resist it. And it's important that we entertain realities and systems of justice that continue to acknowledge people's humanity.